Welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis, as well as a presenter on Mexico's Sin Muros on Canal Once. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing? Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine.
Don't mean to interrupt your reading.
Well, it's holiday week here.
It is holiday week.
It's Semana Santa. So sorry, I was doing a little reading. Catching up on the reading that I often can't get to and having a little Oaxacan quiche. So salud.
Cheers.
Salud, everybody. Quiche. But fine. I'll put down my Eduardo Galeano here, Voices of Time.
Oh, very nice. Very apropos. Of course, we just passed the 10-year anniversary of his death.
That's right.
Very recently here. In fact, I tried to go to a reading of some of his works over at Palacio de Bellas Artes, that gorgeous building here near the Alameda Central in Mexico City, but it was full. Couldn't get in.
Yeah.
That was the popularity of Eduardo Galeano. Lots of people interested in him even now, a decade, hard to believe, after his death.
That is hard to believe. And, that's a testament to how influential he was and has been.
Absolutely.
That was still full. So, my name is Kurt Hackbarth. On vacation, but here with you because, podcasts never sleep. Writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States, Canal Once here in Mexico City, ready for another episode of Soberanía. I can just blow a hole right in our nose. Microphone that we spent all that money on. So, but here we are. And we've got, even though, despite the fact that it is vacation week and a lot of people are clearing out of Mexico City, there is still a lot to talk about. Is there not, Jose Luis?
Absolutely. By the way, this is one of the best cities, one of the best times of the year to be in the city.
It's true.
Yeah, it's really great.
Go to all the museums, all the restaurants, all the cafes. There's nobody on the metro. It's great, actually. So after this, I'm going to go out and kind of explore the city. But here we are with you, and very happy to be here.
And of course, your book was also very relevant to our first topic today. We're going to be talking about Mexico at the Community of Latin American States Summit that was held last week in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. Lots to say about that.
That's right.
Claudia's second international trip. And of course, given the situation in the region, we thought we should also talk about Noboa in Ecuador, which looks like he pretty much stole the election. We're recording this on April 14th. The election was yesterday on April 13th, second round. Probably more information will come tomorrow, but we should pretty much say that it doesn't look like this was a legitimate result. It's quite unbelievable in a lot of ways. And of course, the regional response will be important in that case. We're also going to be talking about Whither Morena. Mm-hmm. Where is Morena at these days, given a lot of internal issues that are coming to light? Morena supporters tend to kind of keep things behind closed doors, not airing the dirty laundry out in the open, but a lot of things have broken through for, I think, very legitimate reasons, which gives us an excuse to talk about these things here on the program. And of course, losers and haters. We're going to be talking about some, frankly, outright dishonest coverage by some well-known figures in the Mexican media who fell for another piece of fake news. All right, first topic. Like I said, we're going to be talking about Mexico at the CELAC Summit. And of course, just to set the scene for you, want to mention, for those of you who aren't familiar, CELAC, very briefly, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. It was created during that first pink wave by the Venezuelan government, led by the Venezuelan government of Hugo Chavez, who basically said it was necessary to create a space for the region to come together without the interference or the influence of the imperialist powers in the region. And of course, I'm talking about the United States and Canada, who play an outsized role in the other regional body, the Organization of American States. We've obviously criticized the OAS very frequently on this program, but suffice it to say, there's a reason why important revolutionary figures called it the Ministry of Colonies of the United States. It tends to be a space that facilitates U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere and doesn't actually allow for the regional integration, which, as we're witnessing, is not only urgent but necessary given what's happening in Washington right now. And this does mark Claudia's second trip abroad. And it's actually due, I think this is a funny anecdote. She said it at the Mañanera before she left, that it was thanks to the insistence of Honduran president, the then current president pro tempore of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, Xiomara Castro, who herself is the spouse of Mel Zelaya, who was ousted by a coup that the OAS did very little to actually stop from actually being realized and then securing its place in power.
With a nudge by Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. Worth remembering the bipartisan imperialist consensus.
Of course.
And yeah, so Xiomara insisted, Claudia, please, this is important. We want to have lots of heads of state there. And of course, the heads of state of Brazil, the other major economic power in the region, the one and two here in Latin America, Lula da Silva, the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, Bolivian president, Lucho Arce, the head of Grenadines, Raúl González as well, and Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. Right. So a lot of important heads of state were there as well. Apologies if I missed anybody, but clearly, they all responded to Xiomara Castro's call for there to be an important turnout given the world situation now and the need for regional unity. And of course, Claudia also took the opportunity to make an important speech there and deliver a very concrete proposal, which we'll get to in just a second. But your thoughts on CELAC, Kurt?
Right. So, as you set the stage very well, Jose Luis, CELAC was kind of the tail end of this great optimistic decade for Latin American and Southern Cone integration in the zeros, 20 odd years ago. That first real wave of Latin American integration. Also in the context of, George Baby Bush and, his overreach in the world and Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, right? Like, Trump now and his new phase of imperial overreach. And also the fact that, the United States' attention was, focused in the Middle East.
That's right.
And so it's like, let's take advantage and get moving on some of this. So, you had proposals like UNASUR, you had proposals like ALBA, you had, great projects like Telesur, where you worked.
That's right.
A few years ago now.
That was a decade ago.
A decade ago now. Time goes, flies by for all of us. Right? We're talking about Galeano. CELAC comes at the tail end of this. At a joint summit of the Rio Group and the Caribbean Community in 2010. The idea was we really need a grouping that can speak for us and is not under the OAS umbrella, right? Those of us who follow Mexican politics closely, you lose count of the number of times that right-wing Mexican politicians go crying off to the OAS and its then leader, Luis Almagro, right, who was instrumental in, in the Bolivia coup of 2019, right, among other things. Actually, our podcast began with that.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. Xochitl goes to Washington.
Running off to Washington to cry to the OAS. They're doing things we don't like. And there really was, in the AMLO administration, a concerted push to resurrect CELAC as, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states as a counterpart to the OAS, right? As a counterpart to the OAS. And there was actually some real, strong rhetoric, kind of mid-AMLO, that they wanted to not only either reform the OAS, or some of you had even talked about, scrapping it altogether, which would be the way to go. But that didn't come to fruition. Of course, there was the pushback from the U.S. AMLO gave, and we've talked about this quite a bit on this program, a very important speech on July 24th, 2021, which was on the birthday of Simón Bolívar, who had the original dream of uniting Latin America, uniting South America, right? And that was coincidentally right around the time when the Monroe Doctrine comes around, 1823, to counter not only, they always say in U.S. schools, it was to counter European attempts to get a foothold back in Latin America. Okay. But it was against the Bolivarian dream of a united Latin America. That's what it was.
That's what it really was.
That's what it really was. Yeah. So,
this weekend I went to the Jose Marti Cultural Center.
Oh.
And there's this beautiful mural inside of the space. And one of them is obviously Jose Marti being an important Cuban anti-imperialist as well, saying, "Oh, Mexico, querido, Mexico amado, be careful of the dangers that are near you."
There you go. Right. And, you don't have to look any farther than Paul Wolfowitz, the Wolfowitz Doctrine, much more recently in the 90s, prevent the rise of regional powers, right? So the attempt to undercut Latin American or Latin American Caribbean unity goes back, almost as long as the existence of the United States itself. Now, I just wanted to quote quickly AMLO's 2021 speech to set the stage for this topic, right? If you want to know more, I have a piece in Jacobin called AMLO Wants a United Latin America. Just Google that, AMLO Wants a United Latin America. It goes into more detail here. But AMLO said in that speech, throughout most of the 19th century, we experienced constant occupations, invasions, annexations. We're talking about Mexico. And in the Great Blow of 1848, it cost us the loss of half of our territory. This violent territorial expansion of the United States was consecrated when Cuba, Spain's last bastion in the Americas, fell in 1898 with the suspicious sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana. Since that time, Washington has never ceased carrying out overt or covert operations against the independent countries south of the Rio Grande. So a very forthright speech in this respect, right? Then just to skip a little bit to set the stage for what we're talking about here, AMLO's proposal was no more and no less than to build something similar to the European Union, but in accordance with our history, our reality, and our identities. In this spirit, we should not rule out the replacement of the OAS with a truly autonomous organization, not a lackey of anyone, but a mediator at the request and acceptance of parties in conflict in matters of human rights and democracy. What is proposed here may seem utopian. However, it should be considered that without the horizon of ideals, we will get nowhere, and consequently, it is worth trying. Let's keep Bolivar's dream alive. This is AMLO, beautiful, in July of 2021. What happens after that? Well, obviously, U.S. pressure in the Biden administration made itself felt, and very quickly, AMLO tweaked the rhetoric to say, yes, we want a united region that also includes the United States. Well, yeah, that doesn't work. I mean, if you want to have Latin American regional unity, you can't have the imperial power involved in the grouping, right? Just ask the countries of the European Union what happens to the peripheral economies when you have, abusive practices from the core countries.
I would think the Greeks have a lot to say.
Yeah, I have a little to say to the Irish, the Portuguese. So I mean, it's just
it doesn't work.
It doesn't work, at all. And it would be tying in all of Latin America and the Caribbean to then a legal juridical straitjacket that they could never get out of, right? Once, we're talking about patents, we're talking about copyrights, we're talking about, investor arbitration panels, and it would be a nightmare. But it's interesting that so disputed is this territory that AMLO felt obligated to take this forthright speech and tweak it to say we want to include the United States in this. Then Claudia Sheinbaum has originally inherited this AMLO rhetoric of, yes, let's have a regional, trading bloc that includes the United States and all of Latin America. And we've talked about why, with these tariff threats and the idea of creating a regional bloc that could, substitute China with this, trade war that's going on. I understand the strategy of it, but, it's highly problematic that you want to have a bloc that includes the United States. So all of that's the background to last week's CELAC conference, right? So Claudia was persuaded to go, and good for Xiomara for insisting until she succeeded. And so Claudia goes and is very warmly received. We're talking about, a president who has amongst the highest approval ratings of any country in the world, not to mention Latin America itself, where, not many leaders are particularly popular at this moment. And she went there and gave a short but, very punctual speech at the table. And here's what she said. She proposed that CELAC convene a summit for the economic well-being of Latin America and the Caribbean. So let me repeat that. A summit for the economic well-being of Latin America and the Caribbean, not the United States. In order to, and I quote, make reality a regional economic integration on the basis of shared prosperity and respect for our sovereignties, close quote. She also assured that solidarity and mutual support characterize the history of the region, sometimes, and added that, and again I quote, currently or today should not be the exception. These are moments of, greater will in order to stimulate the improvement and well-being of our peoples, close quote. So, interesting, isn't it? As it always, and now that Trump with his on again, off again, yes, no, tariffs, this whole circus of the last few weeks and months, which we see is rapidly changing the configuration of the geopolitical chessboard. We see the president of China visiting, including historical adversaries like Vietnam. We see China, Japan, and South Korea even talking about creating an alliance. We see all kinds of interesting alliances sprouting up because of Trump's stupid belligerence. And now we see the resurrection of the Latin American regional unification idea, but Latin America and the Caribbean, at least in this context or in this summit, not the United States.
Yeah. And of course, we have that tweet that you put up saying that, right? As in Asia, the volatility of Trump is driving new alliances and groupings. And I think that's
right.
really important. The conditions have changed, and therefore we must be quick enough to also respond to this moment. And I think, yes, I agree, having gone in person was important because we saw Claudia take advantage of the opportunity by also having some bilateral meetings as well with other regional leaders, with Lula, with Petro as well. So I think that's important as well. She did it at the G20, although unfortunately including Gabriel Boric in that group, saying the progressives of Latin America. I think
my eyes are rolling here. My eyes are rolling.
To cut him out, of course. But I wanted to emphasize that point. I think it's important for us to have a conversation around what does economic well-being for the region look like, given the reality, given politics, geopolitics in 2025, as driven by Trump's erratic, irrational policy, and having to consider what that's going to look like in a region that is increasingly aligned with China. Right? We've seen this really kind of infamous graph where the countries that used to have the number one trading relationship with the United States,
and in the year 2000, for example,
basically, all now have it. Basically, there's I think it's Paraguay, Mexico, obviously, and I can't remember the rest, but it's other than them,
I think maybe Panama.
Yeah,
which is a very special case, right?
Yeah, and we see the U.S. trying to re-exert influence over Panama by force. Showing that that's going to be a very kind of different relationship, right? And then putting an emphasis. And the other thing I wanted to talk about at the SELAC conference that came up is migration. So Claudia did mention migration, and I'll read to you the comments that she made at the SELAC conference. She said, quote, "I cannot fail to mention the need to cooperate in attending to the phenomenon of migration from a humanist perspective. Our historical position has been that the most humane way to do so, and with the greatest results, is to address the structural causes of inequality, unemployment, and violence that spur migration, reject racism, classism, the violation of human rights, and the criminalization of our brothers and sisters from our continent who, for whatever reason, have had the need to migrate north." Gustavo Petro also had, I think, a very good intervention on this very issue. The same, in fact, I would say it was better than Claudia's, far more forceful. He actually, what he did was make an analogy.
He's the inheritor of the long tradition of Colombian poetic eloquence and speechifying.
Jorge Alessi Ergatan.
Yeah.
Of course. And he made actually a parallel saying, receiving people chained up the way that they've tried to do is akin to the way that this region also received enslaved human beings.
Absolutely right.
And I think he said, we cannot allow this again, right? Because that is an echo of that past. And that's why we take over permission. Of course, we talked about that on the show of him saying, listen, if it's your policy to deport people en masse, there's not much we can do about it, but we're not going to let you do it this way. And similarly, I think all the countries of the region, and I'm talking to you, Bukele in El Salvador, needs to realize what it actually implies to be playing the United States game when it comes to this. We'll get into it in a minute, but Bukele doing what he's doing is a stain on the history of the Salvadorian people as a whole, that they are the willing actors in some of the grossest, outright fascist kinds of treatment of human beings who are just seeking better opportunities or fleeing violence and credible threats to their lives. It's extraordinary to me. So, I've been really banging the drum around SELAC about the need to have this meeting. I will say this.
Which was delayed, right?
It was delayed. And I will say that the statement was not great. It was a very watered down statement. And even then, it did not get a green light from 3 countries: Nicaragua, Argentina, and Paraguay. All didn't sign on, which is curious because SELAC is supposed to work under consensus, which means that it has to be approved. So they seem to have jumped over that, which I think is necessary. Given the times, we talked about this, given these times, should we really be sticking to this consensus model?
No. The question is, I guess, did they actually kind of say no to the statement, or they just declined to sign it?
They said no.
They actually did
Yeah,
specifically.
they said that there's no
Right.
such thing as a non-consensus statement. So
Okay.
saying that it doesn't even officially represent SELAC.
Mhm.
I mean, there's going to be these actors like this. There's going to be Bukele and Noboa and
Always.
the rest of them, always.
Yeah.
And we're really going to let them be a veto
Right.
in these times. Maybe in the past, where it was necessary to find that common ground. Well, you have a fascist in Washington.
Right. What Claudia did say in her speech, which is important, right, was, no to the embargo on Venezuela, no to the sanction on Venezuela, no to the embargo on Cuba.
Yeah.
Right.
She actually called both of them a blockade, which is right. That's
both
actually
a blockade.
correct terminology.
The correct terminology is both
Is blockade.
Now, I agree that the final statement was not particularly strong, but the fact that Claudia did reaffirm Mexico's historic opposition to the blockade on Venezuela and Cuba in the context of the tariff negotiations with Trump was important. Was important.
Absolutely.
Because Trump is dangling tariffs over the United States, over Mexico constantly, right? The latest one now is if Mexico doesn't cough up water under the water treaty, the tariffs are going on. I mean, right? First, the tariffs were for fentanyl, then they were for migration, and then narco government or whatever, and now it's for the water treaty. Yeah. Right? So in that context of daily bullying and bludgeoning, the fact that you simply restated Mexico's historic position, didn't go beyond it and didn't say much about it, was important.
Yeah. And, we're kind of tired of talking about tariffs. That's why we didn't bring it up on the show today. But worth mentioning, actually, that Trump caved. He caved. Yeah. He saw what was happening to the bond market and was like, my strategy is going to blow up in my face. And I'm going to have to walk this back and exempt a bunch of things. All of the other countries, actually, for a moment there, it looked like we were once again going to be subjected to this 10% across the board, every country in the world tariffs. Thankfully, spared. Sounds like it was a product of negotiations that happened at the last minute in Washington. Marcelo Ebrard seems to be spending a lot of time in Washington these days. And so at least we were spared again. But again, I actually made a comment about this earlier in the week. I mean, you can't operate this way. This kind of erratic policy, yes, no, maybe. In the morning, you're tariffed. In the afternoon, you're not. It's absurd. This is no way to conduct this. Again, all the more reason why a lot needs to come out of this next summit. This economic well-being summit. I wonder who's hosting it. Colombia is the next pro tempore presidency of CELAC, so now they will be
Colombia would be the logical place, but Sheinbaum had said Mexico's available if they want to have it here. I was going to say just that. She said Mexico's available.
Why not do it here? Why not do it here? Any last words on this topic before we move on to our next one?
Well, just very quickly, too, on the tariffs thing, Mexico says it's continuing to negotiate on, the 25% tariffs on autos, which remains in place, right? Steel, aluminum, and autos. What's interesting is China is playing hardball, and China's got the minerals that everything needs for all this electronic stuff, and those minerals are stopped at Chinese ports.
Yeah, and you can't exactly find them everywhere else.
Yeah, you can't just kind of.
While they might be.
Here's some minerals, right?
Oddly enough, they're called rare earth. They're not that rare. But the process of actually making them usable is almost exclusively Chinese. How about that? And of course, when we're talking about CELAC, it's important to mention its counterpart, the OAS. And I wanted to bring this up as a segue to our next topic, which is, of course, the election results in Ecuador yesterday. Heraldo Muñoz, the ex-foreign minister of Chile, who was the head of the OAS mission to the Ecuadorian elections,
speaking of the OAS,
just said that they expressed their full confidence in the results of the second round presidential elections as published by the Electoral Authority. And they highlight that their data coincides with the information compiled by the observers. So a full-throated defense of what is likely electoral fraud.
By the OAS.
That's what it is. Once again, we're seeing the OAS play the role of U.S.-sponsored regime promotion, in this case, of a very dangerous figure in Daniel Noboa. So why do we say that this is a suspicious result? So I think it's important for us to talk about the reaction by the official opposition. So Luis Morales was a candidate of the Revolutionary Party, the inheritors of the Correa government, which governed Ecuador for 10 years, and addressing supporters at their headquarters last night says this is one of the worst frauds that grotesque electoral frauds in the history of the Republic of Ecuador. We'll have this video running on the background here for those of you who are watching this by video. She says, we do not recognize the results presented by the National Electoral Council in Ecuador. We're going to demand a vote recount and for the ballot boxes to be opened. Voto por voto, casilla por casilla.
Yeah.
So, of course, the Mexico connection is that Mexico has an experience of having to face down electoral fraud. Not once, not twice in modern history, but several times. But the most one that is probably has the most parallels to this is 2006, where López Obrador won the election, but through vote buying and outright vote rigging, Felipe Calderón of the National Action Party was able to consolidate his not victory and actually assume the presidency.
But there they just pretended he won by 0.5 point, not by 11.
So that's exactly it. And you bring me to the point that I wanted to bring up. There is a lot of evidence. We have this post here from Ben Norton, if you want to check it out, of a huge electoral fraud in Ecuador, which is ruled by right-wing oligarch President Daniel Noboa, closely linked to drug trafficking. Ecuadorians say he is a dictator. So here's the thing that I think is most worrisome. Number one, a lot of people will probably compare this to Venezuela in the last presidential election, saying, oh, there was a fraud there. The electoral authorities cannot be trusted, et cetera, et cetera. The difference is, in Venezuela, the opposition cried fraud in every single election it didn't win. It won 2 elections, and in those ones, it praised the electoral authority. But in the ones that they lost, they cried fraud in every single one. Whereas the opposition in the Citizens Revolution Party in Ecuador has always respected the results and said, we were not able to win this time around for whatever reason.
Against Lasso.
Against Lasso and Noboa in those the snap elections that were held 18 months ago. And so, given the fact that these are very different political actors here, their accusations of electoral fraud are far more credible.
Carry more weight.
Far more credible. And of course, you made the point just now that how is it believable that Noboa, who squeaked into first place in the first round, because Ecuador has 2 rounds of elections if nobody gets 50% of the vote, in this case won by a landslide. It doesn't pass the smell test whatsoever. How can Luisa González lose votes in their strongholds in the second round, despite the fact that they actually expanded their coalition, reaching agreements with other progressive forces in the country? It doesn't make a lick of sense.
And not to mention, I'm just quoting here from today's editorial on the Jornada. A lot of the fraud, a lot of the cases, the fraud is before the votes are even counted.
Yeah.
Right. The fraud starts ahead of time. So among the irregularities signaled by the left in this case was Galopante, which is massive propaganda, advertising on national television stations until 4 days before the election, when you're supposed to have a blackout of a prohibition on that kind of advertising. The use of public money to pay for Noboa's tours, the declaration of a state of exception in half of the country.
And all of the leftist strongholds.
A state of exception. That is, curfews and
suspension of constitutional rights.
Right? And then, it just goes on and on and on and on from there. So,
well, one important thing.
Yeah.
He was not allowed to run for re-election as a sitting president.
Right.
It's explicitly clear.
Yeah.
But he just flouted it and said, no, I'm going to be president.
Right.
And
didn't even step down.
Didn't step down, which is demanded by the electoral law and the Constitution.
Now, we've talked on this show, and we'll talk about it more, but Ecuador has become the newest foothold for Southcom in South America, right?
Yeah.
Noboa basically signed over to the United States the ability to, at will, enter Ecuador's land, sea, and air territories, signed over the Galapagos Islands for a U.S. base.
Which is also in violation of the Ecuadorian Constitution.
So it's all, under the guise of the drug war and claiming the drug war this, drug war that. And it's funny that even Drop Site News, as Ryan Grimm is reporting that we were saying this before, right? That they were, blaming the Correístas for the assassination of the presidential candidate in the last time, with, as a way to defame their their candidacy.
Yeah, which again, to bring back the Mexico connection,
Yep.
that's actually the reason why relations became strained between Ecuador and Mexico.
Right,
Which still have not
Kamlo
been
commented that. He
'cause
said
Kamlo
it's
was
very
like,
strange.
somebody
Yeah.
ended up, benefiting from this assassination, and it was the guy in power. And of course, saying the truth apparently is a little bit too offensive for Daniel Noboa.
Right. So just to reiterate, just so people know that AMLO made that comment that you just mentioned. Ecuador got upset. AMLO said, "Well, that's I'm not retracting it. That's what happened." And this was the whole sequence of events that led to Mexico providing what do we call it, to Jorge Glass?
Political asylum.
Political asylum. Thank you very much. Correa's former vice president. And he was in the Mexican embassy the night that, Noboa's goons stormed the embassy, again in violation of all kinds of international law, kidnapped Glass. He remains kidnapped. And after that, Mexico broke diplomatic relations with Ecuador, a situation that persists to this day. Mexico has no diplomatic relations with Ecuador, and there's no, it doesn't look like that's going to be restored anytime soon with the way things are going on. So today, of course, Claudia was asked about this. This is today, Monday, right? You'll be seeing this on Tuesday. Was asked at the Mañanera to make a comment about that, and she was very diplomatic, saying, Luisa Gonzalez does not accept the results, so we will not make a pronouncement, which is, it's the correct thing to do. She could have said more, but she made the correct statement to say, one candidate does not accept the results. We can't, do something stupid like Boric or the OAS and say,
Congratulations
on
your reelection.
Your reelection, right? Yeah. Because this is what so angered Mexicans in 2006 when countries are like, Calderon, congratulations. It's like, no, the process hasn't concluded yet.
Exactly. So yeah, at the very least, we have pause, right? A cool head, as Claudia always says, to wait to see what happens. There surely it maybe is reasons behind the opposition candidate saying that we don't recognize the results, and so we'll have to follow that. And that's a consistent position, right? When there has been disputed laws, including in the U.S., Mexico has been respectful of the fact that you have to let the process play out, saying then to Biden that they weren't going to congratulate him on his victory
in 2020
until it played out, until the authorities pronounced themselves, as they should.
That's the response. That's actually the response.
Which was the same case in Venezuela. Let's wait for the electoral authorities to say what they have to say. Now, of course, the difference here again is that the electoral authorities have allowed themselves to be bullied by the Noboa government. Last night, in an extraordinary scene, as they were announcing the results, they were literally surrounded by military troops to clearly try to send an intimidating message. And as you well said, what does a character like Gabriel Boric have to say about that?
I wanted this to be in Losers and Haters, but we've got another Losers and Haters, so we pushed this one up. But it could have been in either one of these two segments.
I have here on the screen, it's no accident some of the voices that leaped to denounce an alleged fraud hours after polls closed in Venezuela are suddenly silent when the left-wing coalition, which unlike the US-backed opposition in Venezuela has always respected the results, points to credible evidence of fraud in Ecuador. And of course, Boric this morning sends its greetings to the Ecuadorian people for its democratic participation yesterday, celebrating President-elect.
First thing in the morning, right? First thing in the morning.
So
from Chile, we salute the Ecuadorian people for their democratic participation yesterday. I congratulate President-elect Daniel Noboa for this
new period that will begin, and we recognize also those like Luisa Gonzalez who contributed to strengthening the democratic debate. Very interesting that when it was Venezuela, he was so quick to allege fraud, and this one were very credible accusations of electoral irregularities. He rushes to declare. Glad Claudia is taking a pause here. And of course, who else besides the OAS, besides the fake leftist Gabriel Boric? Well, the U.S. Department of State. Very quickly, again this morning, releasing it, right? It's no coincidence. And here I said, when the opposition in Venezuela cried fraud, the White House couldn't move fast enough to back their claims. Now that the opposition in Ecuador is alleging fraud, they rushed to recognize the questionable result and label it explicitly so, as the OAS did, free, fair, and transparent, despite the irregularities. And irregularities are many. You can actually see this statement from the Citizens Revolution Party, which says explicitly RC5, that's the their number in the electoral law there in Ecuador. RC5 has conclusive scientific evidence demonstrating the mathematical impossibility of these official results. Just displaying to you, I saw this other one, I couldn't find it for this morning, but basically the graph goes like this. In the snap elections, they went here. The difference was sizable. In the first round, they were very, very narrow.
16,000.
And then almost unprecedented. Mm-hmm. The difference shoots up between the first place and the second place. It makes no statistical sense whatsoever.
And it goes against
any electoral expert.
It goes against electoral polls. It goes against the exit polls. All of that.
Now, funny that you mentioned the exit polls. I'll let you continue in a second. Just because the OAS statement explicitly talks about exit polls in this case, which is very curious because they didn't say that about the Mexican one, did they? Mm-hmm. Where they used fake election exit polls, saying the mission considers that it is important that they respect institutional instances established, blah, 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 to continue to work. The observation mission observed the polls and the exit polls demonstrated should not be used as an element to predict the results. So specifically criticizing the use of exit polls to substantiate
in this case, right?
In this
which
case.
had Luis, I think, winning by 4 points, right?
Exactly.
3 or 4, right?
Yeah. And as the La Jornada editorial said, a lot of the fraud happens before the actual voting day.
Said, right?
Not a single word about all of Noboa's flagrant violations of the law and the Constitution in this electoral process.
Exactly right. Now, with regards to Boric, even if Boric believes that Noboa won, okay, because, Boric is Boric. What a ridiculous slap in the face to Luisa Gonzalez to not simply wait for the process to conclude. Then you can see that he's actually operating as a U.S. puppet.
Of course.
Totally U.S. puppet.
Yeah.
Right?
I wonder what they've promised him. Because in Chile, you can't run for immediate re-election. So it's quite likely the fascist right is going to win and then their next election. I wonder what they've promised him to take this position. Or maybe these are his principles. Maybe he just loves the taste of U.S.-made leather.
And we saw, right, that famous picture of Laura Richardson Southcom with Allende's granddaughter, make Allende's, roll over in his grave how many times, right? I think it was on the same trip that she'd been in Ecuador first, right? So, Ecuador, Chile, Chile, Ecuador.
There you have it. All right, so we'll have to keep our eye on that. Like I said, we are kind of rushing on this one, but we thought it was important to mention because this is going to be, if he's able to consolidate this fraud, it's going to be another Bukele in the region. It's going to be another barrier to consensus. It's going to be another player that possibly accepts people chained up, returned to a country that isn't even their own, right? I think this is a Bukele in the making in Daniel Noboa, who has credible accusations of narco trafficking, which also exposes yet another element of the hypocrisy of the U.S. State Department and the White House in general.
Right. So you see El Salvador, where there's very credible evidence that Bukele was negotiating with MS-13. Right. You see Noboa in this credible evidence there, but it's funny that the narco state, according to the U.S. press, is Mexico.
Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Funny that.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to our next topic, Wither Morena. And I'm going to really quickly throw a couple of headlines here up on the screen to talk about some of these issues. So here we have one of the cartoonists here in Mexico, part of El Chamuco. Check out El Chamuco for a Spanish-speaking audience. Saying here, quoting an interview with Hugo López-Gatell, who was the COVID czar here in Mexico during López Obrador's government, saying that the Secretary of Public Education, headed by Mario Delgado, former Morena president, is kind of giving them what is lava la cara in English?
Yeah, he's kind of, the literal translation is washing their face, but he's kind of, laundering their image.
Laundering their image. Perfect translation. Thank you, Kurt. That the Secretary of Public Education is laundering the image of the industry that makes junk food, given this push now to get junk food out of
public schools, which is a great push.
Yep.
That was just passed and just enacted very recently.
Here we have the academics with Palestine criticizing one of the Morena lawmakers, Hugo Flores,
Mhm.
who's using his post to actually promote the so-called fake Hasbara discourse around Israel's right to defend itself, which is bullshit. Using his position to take a position that is actually basically advocating or providing cover for genocide.
That's right.
And then, of course, we have this one as well, Andrea Chavez, who has received a lot of criticism because of her, large amount of self-promotion in the run-up, which is still years away, for the governorship of her home state
Chihuahua.
of Chihuahua.
Mhm.
And you can see this image here for those who are watching us on video of the very polemical ambulances, which very loudly say Andrea Chavez, senadora, with a picture of her actually pasted on the side. Now, to her credit, she said that they will remove those images now from these ambulances.
But it should never have happened.
But it's all there. I mean, that's clearly the intention there. I mean, it's actually her name is bigger letters than the word ambulance, which is really quite extraordinary. So all of these stories, Kurt, what does it tell us about situation happening right now inside of Morena, which some of these issues, which normally probably would have stayed behind closed doors, now kind of breaking through, breaking forward, and even having the head of Morena today, Luis Alcalde, commenting in response to some words that Claudia said about this issue.
Right. So let's put some context here as well. Morena has been, I think, without a doubt, the most successful political party of the last decade and perhaps of the 21st century, in the sense that it was founded as an association in the wake of the 2012 election by López Obrador. It only acquired official party status in 2014, just 2014. 2015, it had its first go at elections, winning a respectable number of seats in Congress. And then 2018, it wins the presidency in a landslide. 4 years after being founded as a party, and has won now 2 consecutive electoral landslides, holding Congress, and not only that, but achieving a supermajority with defections from the opposition senators in both houses of Congress. So it's been a meteoric rise in Morena, a meteoric rise. Much of that has to do with López Obrador and his coattails and the movement behind that. It didn't come out of nowhere. The long movement, going back to 2006 electoral fraud, 1988, the 68 students movement. There's a lot of history behind it. It didn't just pop out of nowhere. But the rise has been meteoric. So usually parties have time to work out their growing pains before they have to govern a country, right? And in this, the party worked out its growing pains at the same time that it's governing. And there's been some problems. As you said, a lot of times they try to keep the problems, under wraps. And there's always the debate about to what extent is criticizing the party helping the right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you can't give a free pass to some of this stuff either.
They often would defer to the moral leadership of López Obrador.
Right.
Like if López Obrador criticized it, then they're like, okay, we've gone too far kind of situation, which is somewhat similar to what we're seeing happen right now with Sheinbaum.
That's right. So what you see here is, for example, and there's a long history of this in Mexican politics and other countries as well, but in Mexico, this idea of what they're called the chapulines, the grasshoppers. The party that is powerful attracts like moths to the flame, right? People from other parties that jump like grasshoppers onto the Morena ticket. And there's been way too much of that, permissiveness of, people who've been either on the Morena ticket or on their smaller satellite parties that are part of the coalition. Remember, Morena is the big party, and it's got 2 satellites, which is the Workers' Party, the PT, and the Green Party. And the Green Party is absolutely a mercenary party that used to be allied with the PRI for many years, with the PRI. And so a lot of times...
And they'll take just about anybody.
Yeah. And they're impresentables. You can kind of shove them into the Green Party.
Which has kind of been the Morena strategy.
Right.
The ones that can't run for Morena because they're just a little bit too tainted.
Yeah, you just throw them over there.
They'll be a candidate in one of the Green Party alliance.
Right. Now, Cuauhtémoc Blanco, for example, the former soccer hero, the governor of Morelos, right? Accused of sexual assault and stuff. He was not Morena originally. He was
PES.
PES.
Social.
Right. And that's the same party of Hugo Flores, this ultra right-wing Christian evangelical party, which now Flores, for certain services rendered, it now is a Morena congressperson and is, pushing the Hasbara line from a Morena seat. That is when you have to say enough is enough. enough is enough. Oaxacans, I've lived in Oaxaca for a long time before moving up here for Canaronce.
Ooh, they have a lot to say about their governor.
They're their governor, Solomon Jara, is not doing a good job. But also the former governor, Alejandro Morat, who was, the corrupt head of Infonavit at the time, is now a Morena senator. He's a Morena senator, right? He's not formally part of the party, but he is, he's a Morena senator in that chamber, right? And there was also the case of what was the other case too of the former panista there from was it Veracruz?
Yunes,
yeah. Right? Miguel Angel Yunes, who Morena got the vote which they needed for, I think it was the judicial reform.
That's right.
And if you get a vote from an opposition person in the Congress, I understand that you need to get the votes. But then Yunes applied to be part of Morena. And actually, the bases rose up and said, no, Yunes. And actually, that didn't happen. That got stopped.
Yeah.
Which was good.
He withdrew it, but really on the same day that they were going to tell him no.
Right. So it was all just to maintain appearances. But then you have these kinds of cases that you just mentioned, which is Hugo Flores. You have the case of Andrea Chavez, right? Andrea Chavez is a young, up-and-coming senator, right? Very ambitious, right? She and her partner, Abraham Mendieta. And there's nothing wrong with having ambitions in politics, although being too ambitious, it's like the famous Icarus myth. Watch out, yeah. Right? And there's no need for her to be splashing her name all over Chihuahua.
Exactly. That's my point.
There's no
I
need
actually
for
kind of
it.
like her,
Yeah.
right? It's nice to have a young person who's good in front of the cameras, who's witty, but don't be so nakedly ambitious. It goes against sort of one of the kind of core principles of Morena, of actually like they're supposed to be different.
Yeah.
They're supposed to represent something a little bit more pure. And to go out there and just so nakedly ambitious, right? She went from being diputada to senadora and now really urgently wants to be
and she wants
governor.
to be governor and she wants to be president.
I assume, right?
I have no doubt.
I mean, and that's fine if that's, but like let the process play out in the transparent, legal way, not just because you kind of have the best communication strategy should you be the candidate and therefore continue to rise in the ranks like that. You do a good job of where you're at. I mean, personally, as a Mexican, I don't like it when they jump from post to post. Oh, now I want to be mayor of Mexico City, so I'm going to resign from this post. And now I want to be senator, so I'm going to resign from.
Right.
Finish your terms.
Finish your terms.
Yeah. In fact, in Mexico, you can't resign your term.
Yeah.
A publicly elected post is not renounceable. Your suplente takes over because that's how sacred the actual
But
office.
then people take license. They take licencia, which is the way of
how they get around it. And you're right. Yes, she did finish her.
She did finish her term as diputada.
As her term as diputada. Yeah.
Just so people understand, right? There are strict and specific campaign periods in Mexico that you can only be doing campaign publicity during those times. So you can't be doing it outside, right? So I mean, the electoral law is very clear on this, right? Morena has been so stratospherically successful, in large part because it's been able to paint the corruption of the neoliberal era for what it was, but also pointed to how parties before flaunted the law.
Yeah.
Right? PRI governors, Operación Zafiro with Cesar Duarte, basically raiding state budgets to pay for PRI campaigns and all this stuff, and diverting money like aureoles from health budgets into the Latinos, media right-wing media project. So that's always been a very important moral argument from the left, that we represent a different way of doing politics. So you can't be then falling into these kind of violations of electoral law. And it was actually the Monero, the political cartoonist Hernandez, who really forthrightly came out and said that. And then the attacks on top of him for saying that. Now, just to kind of go into this a little bit more too, because Morena is a big tent party. So you have people on the left, you have people on the center, and then unfortunately you have people even on the right, like this axes of certain political malfeasance is Ricardo Monreal and his right-hand man, Pedro Aces, in the CATEM union, who is against the 40-hour work week, a union leader who's against the 40-hour work week, who's been instrumental in blocking the 40-hour work week, and was proposed into the Congress the Diligencia Cobrada law, which would have allowed companies to garnish wages to pay for workers' debts. Allow employers to act as collection agencies. It's the most anti-worker law you could possibly imagine. It didn't pass. But it didn't pass because Claudia threatened to veto it. It got farther in Congress than the 40-hour work week has. And that's because of Monreal and Pedro Aces. Morena, diputados, both of them.
Here's the thing. They're smart political operatives. They know how to get things moving.
Yeah.
But sometimes the things that get moving are against the interests of the working class. And that's a great example of it.
The delegancia cobrada.
Which is why you have to be really careful about these actors who are full-time politicians and who know how to game the system to get what they want or get, the powerful interests that back them to get what they want.
And the other shrewd political operator in Morena, of course, is a senator, is Adán Augusto, right? And Andrea Chavez, was allied with Adán Augusto in the primary campaigns last year.
That's right.
And, that alliance, you see the problem. Yeah. You see the problem when you have this operator like Adán Augusto, and then you have Andrea Chavez splashing your name all over these ambulances. Yeah. It's like,
which takes away from the actual act.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you wanted to deliver healthcare, audible. I applaud you for it.
Yeah.
You don't have to promote yourself through it.
Yeah.
The people will see who's actually delivering. Like that's why it's so offensive to the López Obradoristas to kind of expand beyond Morenistas. Because the idea is that el pueblo es sabio. The people are wise. And if you deliver to them, you don't need to splash your name and logo all over the things because they will see it because they have elevated their political level to understand that much. And that's why it's so disappointing to see people go down this path. It's not even necessary and it goes against kind of the principles of this party in the first place. But of course, we do have a moral voice at the top, which is Claudia Sheinbaum.
And Claudia Sheinbaum has weighed in on this and said she will be sending a letter to Morena. This is Tuesday, so it would be Monday of next week, right? To lay out her vision of an ethical party. And it's actually, this is something that she said before, right? She's laid out this idea of, the party has to have that, that ethical backing, right? And I hope the Morena leadership listens, because there's also been questions about the Morena leadership, which is Luisa Alcalde, Andy López Obrador, AMLO's son, as to whether they're up to the challenge of, the important challenge of leading this party, right? There was this kind of a silly thing, but, at the rally, the rally that the massive public rally against
in defense
Trump,
of sovereignty.
In defense of sovereignty, Claudia Sheinbaum shows up, heads toward the podium, was announced multiple times, and it just symbolically,
the other 350,000 people certainly noticed that she had arrived.
And just this symbolically very awkward moment, to say the least. There was Adán Augusto and Andy López Obrador and Luisa Alcalde, and I think it was also Monreal. They were all taking a giant selfie with each other, the head of the Partido Verde. And Claudia's like, hey, walking by here, hello. And she had to almost tap them on the shoulder. And they're like, oh.
Too late.
Too late.
The president waits for no one. Are you kidding?
So the president kept walking, right? Of course, the opposition tried to play this up as that ruined the event and that ruined the day. And they tried to make that the story. That wasn't the story. The story was the massive public, attendance at this rally that was, overflowed the Zocalo for blocks and blocks and blocks. But is it as an example of not good frivolousness on their part? Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was.
And in many ways, that may have been kind of the turning point for a lot of people. Be like, you know what? We need to kind of clean house a bit.
Yeah.
And we need to get this behavior out of the party. And I hope they follow Claudia's letter to the letter and actually follow the advice that she's going to be giving in that. I do think that she occupies an important role as also a moral authority, the way that López Obrador did.
Right. And she has to, play that line because she's not a Morena figure. She's the president of the country. Right? Yes. It's Morena that has to clean up its act from within, not because the president says so, right? You don't want to go back to the days when the PRI was just an appendage to the presidency. Yeah. Right? Morena has to clean up its act from within. But as many people have pointed out, with the PRI and the PAN and even Movimiento Ciudadano, there's no opposition to speak of at this point in Mexico. I put up that poll on Macio Sarri program last week. One of the latest polls had PRI at 8%. Oh. It had the PAN at 7% in voting intention for the midterms, and I think it had Movimiento Ciudadano at 10%. Morena was at 40 or something. So, Morena is in no imminent danger of anything for now. But you have these small things that add up, that accumulate, and people start seeing them. And so the enemy within is within the party.
Mhm.
It's not in the opposition. The opposition is inconsequential at this point.
Mao warned us about that.
What's that? Yeah.
He led a whole revolution to clean up the party from the inside. You don't want to get to that position.
Yeah.
You want to be able to handle it through your mechanism. All right, final topic for today, losers and haters, of course. I'm going to bring this post up from Julian Macias. We're a big fan of his work. Obviously, following all of the different kind of online misbehavior, misdeeds of people who think they can pull a fast one on you. And of course, the latest story is here. I'll translate the tweet that he put up. This is the opposition in Mexico. The coordinator of the Mexico United movement publicized a photo of the King Juan Carlos getting on a plane in 2022 and claimed that it was AMLO getting on a private plane using the hashtag narco ex-president AMLO. It's trying to attempt to link him to narco trafficking. So I'll put her tweet, Denise Mead Gaudry, saying, and of course, this is actually an effort to break up the support of the Morena bases, saying like, you see this president that you respect so much. Now he's flying private. He used to fly commercial, but now it was all show. Look at him now. And of course, it is not López Obrador boarding a plane at all. It is here proven from a date of the 24th of May, 2022. It's actually the Spanish king, Juan Carlos, getting on a private plane, not López Obrador at all. And of course, you can always look at the tail number on the plane. All of this is independently verifiable. But that did not stop a number of Mexican journalists from retweeting this and claiming that it was a picture of López Obrador flying on a private plane.
Like Ruben Cortez, the right
journalists should probably verify the information they're putting out there, shouldn't they?
And if it was a smarter hoax, they would have at least changed the tail number.
Right.
But they didn't even do that.
No, they believe the hook, line, and sinker because they're not actual legitimate journalists. They're not.
This is López Rodriguez's right-hand man.
Exactly.
Right?
Who is he?
The former head of the Televisa news anchor who's, now spouts off in his radio program. This is one of his right-hand man over there. Yeah. Someone who you would think would have the experience to know better. But of course, what do they care? Right?
No, if anything, his experience is putting forward the fake news.
I'm saying that very tongue-in-cheek. Yeah.
And it's true, right? Fine. Let's say you didn't verify information. You saw something on your timeline and you retweeted it and without really checking into it. Just accept it and be like, I was wrong. Yeah. Turns out this photo is Juan Carlos. It's not López Obrador at all. Are they going to do that? No.
No, they won't. This is what Pedro Miguel says. This guy who claims to be so, letrado, right? So, cultured, is incapable of writing 6 letters, perdón or sorry, SORRY.
There you have it. And this is the story of Mexican media.
This one is just so dumb. It doesn't even look like AMLO boarding them.
No, I think it's a little bit maybe is like his gait. You could maybe believe that because he was kind of he was always a little bit hunched. But that come on, a blurry picture from 100
boards the
meter
plane
away.
from 2022, and you just say, "Oh, it was AMLO," and then it just it goes and goes.
One reverse image search would have showed me that it was fake. That's it.
That's all it takes.
2 clicks.
Yeah,
but that's not important to them. That's not what they're doing, right? That's not. And then, of course, right, this is all part of a larger ecosystem, right? Like there's not a mistake that Denise posted that hashtag along with it, because that hashtag then gets picked up by the Natalie Kitcherevs of the world who put up stories about narco AMLO accusations.
Like I said in Maciosare, once you have the core lie, narco AMLO and narco government, whatever else, everything else can be related to that. Everything else can be related to that, right? When the narco gobiernos, it's Bukele, it's Noboa. But,
we didn't even mention that. His banana companies have been regularly accused of being part of the shipping of drugs to Europe and North America.
There you go.
All right. Well, that's the end of another program. You mentioned Maciosare a couple of times there, Kurt. People want to check out your show. How can they watch it?
Yeah. So, we're on Canal 11, and fortunately, Canal 11 puts all of its content online. So you can watch our show, Sin Muros, Tuesdays at 8 o'clock. And we've got a new episode coming out. We're not, no break there either this week. So Tuesdays at 8 o'clock on the Canal 11 YouTube page. And then that's on actual, the television network at 11 o'clock. And then Masio Sare is Wednesdays at 9 o'clock. And you can watch it on TV, but you can also watch it on Canal Once's YouTube. So, yeah.
Which is now available in the U.S. thanks to some new agreements negotiated by the new leadership at
That's
Once.
right.
That wasn't
That's
the
right.
case before.
Uh,
So if
most
you're
of
watching this in the U.S., you can watch Canal Once on YouTube, which you couldn't before.
And a lot of cable packages, especially in more Spanish-speaking regions, actually has Channel 11 as part of their cable package.
That's right.
So you can watch it on your TV. Right? Just check if Canal Once is part of your cable package. Because Masio Sare, Sin Muros focuses on the U.S.-Mexico relationship specifically. We have a great time with that. Masio Sare wanders further afield with the topics. So it's a way to dive into a more varied basket of topics related to Mexican politics. And it's just a great, panel. It's Violeta Vázquez Rojas, friend of the show. It's Nancy Flores, probably the best investigative journalist working today on Mexico. It's Daniela Barragan, and Sin Embargo, also a great journalist. And then every night there's another different and interesting panel, always Wednesdays at 9 o'clock.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That one's only available in Spanish, sorry. But Sin Muros is subtitled in English, so you can always check that out as well. All right, thanks so much for joining us. This is the end of another program. And of course, we want to remind the winners of the books. This is your last chance. If you don't get back to us by next Monday, we're picking new winners.
That's right. And so that's Espinorgan and Rosa Ferrer 9726. That's it. This is the last week. Last week, Grace Berry just sending you their addresses.
We're trying to give you a book.
We
will pay for shipping.
We will now have to go to the runners-up. So please.
All right.
That's it.
Give us a like, subscribe if you haven't. Tell your friends. It really helps us out. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Salud. Happy Semana Santa.